Hi, this is Muho, and today I want to do the last part of the My Teacher's House series, which is based on an interview with Edward Moore, which I did about 1 year ago, around this time. The next question is, we've talked a lot about the shortcomings of teachers. From the student's perspective, what's the cut-off point? My answer to that question is, there's these papers that hang on the billboard in the Hiloma, where Uchiyama says you have to choose the right teacher, but because the teacher isn't perfect, you have to become a perfect student and learn in a perfect way from an imperfect teacher. Hiloma is the Japanese word for the room where in Antaiji we eat breakfast and dinner, and also we have, after dinner, we have the tea meetings. In the winter, it's also the only room that's heated, so in the winter, it's also the place where we do the morning zazen and the study groups. And in this room, we have actually several billboards. On one of these boards we write out the plan for the month and who's the cook on certain days and who's in charge of the zendo, and on what day we plan to do what work. But then there's also this billboard where, for example, in the winter there we would hang out the topics of the Dharma talk. But there is this one paper where Uchiyama talks about finding the right teacher, and you can find that paper also, or the text on that paper, on the Antaiji homepage. So I will put a link to that below if you don't know it yet. I think it's a very important text. That's why I put it on the homepage already several years ago. The English title is "To You Who Has Decided to Become a Monk." So if you don't know that text, I recommend that you read through it. And there Uchiyama Roshi basically says something that also Dogen says, that first of all you need to find a true teacher. But then who decides who a true teacher is? Who decides which is the right teacher? Well, basically you have to decide in the end. So when you follow the teacher, you need to be aware of that it's the teacher that you chose. And also it depends on you what you can see in that teacher. You need to find the right teacher because you don't really know yourself, and a true teacher sees things that you don't know yourself. So for that reason, it's just as important or even more important to have a teacher than in sports. For example, you need a trainer. Even if you aspire to become a good musician, it's probably close to impossible to all do it by yourself. You need a teacher who tells you certain things that you cannot see by yourself. But then on the other hand, you also create the teacher. It depends on you what you discover in the teacher. Shakyamuni had hundreds and thousands of students, but each of these students had a different teacher. They all saw a different Shakyamuni, although they maybe thought that they all follow the same teacher. In reality, each of them had a different teacher. And when you look at the teacher, you live with the teacher for several years, you discover he's not perfect, and that can be a big disappointment to see that this teacher who you hoped would be a better version of yourself a better version of your parents. Yeah, something like Shakyamuni living in modern times, but then you discover he's not so different from my parents, not so different from myself, maybe even worse. So what do you do now? Well, maybe you have a look at what Uchiyama Roshi writes. And I continue with my answer to the question. Before you decide, and I mean decide for a teacher, before you decide for a teacher, you need to take a good look. You can only see so much from your perspective at that point. There's always these scandals going on in the world. You need to know when it's not practice. Things that were considered normal in a Zen context before are now seen as power harassments. For example, the stuff that I talked about 2 or 3 times before when I was talking about my experience in the Rinzai Zen monastery, that would be completely impossible in the West now, and it would, even in Japan, it gets very difficult now, and I think that's good. I think it's good. I think it's good. But 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, it was completely normal. I don't know how it was at the time of Dogen. In China, I think it was in the Zuimonki where he relates this episode where his Chinese teacher is apologizing to his students for abusing them sometimes verbally or hitting them with his slippers. And when he's apologizing to his students, then Dogen says all of the students were crying and they were all in tears. So whatever you make out of that, one thing you can take away from that is that even at that time in China, sometimes a teacher thought it's okay to hit the student with a slipper. On the other hand, he knew it was not okay. So on the other hand, he would also feel that he needed to apologize. But if you think only about getting to the question of your own life, to that point, then perhaps it doesn't really matter. So when we think about these cases of abuse of power in the Zen community, well, you can take 2 different perspectives. One is you think about the community as a whole and about what kind of climate do we want to have in Zen. Then harassment, the abuse of power is a big problem. And if you're in the position of a teacher, you have to take responsibility for that. You have to make sure it doesn't happen. On the other hand, if you are at that stage where it's about your own life and death, maybe you ask yourself, why do I have to live in the first place? I could kill myself anytime. Why not today? And maybe at that point you tell yourself, well, maybe I just give it another try. I sit down on this cushion. I join a Zen group. I join this teacher. He looks like a guy who maybe found the answer to this problem that I'm right now struggling with. If you're that kind of person and at that stage of your practice, then the imperfections of a teacher, or the question, is this still teaching or is this already harassment, is probably secondary at that point. It's like at Tofuguchi, so that's the name of the Rinzai monastery I lived in 20 years ago. You either escape over the wall at night or accept your suffering. So many people put up with abuse from the teacher because they are there to solve the answer to their life. Not so many people, but so many. What I'm trying to do is say is that, of course, abuse is not okay, but on the other hand, if it's about solving the answer of your life, probably at that stage you have to just leave every other answer, every other questions to themselves. So basically about myself, 20 years ago when I was in that monastery and I had to deal with that abuse being inflicted on myself, I could have left or I had to accept it, but it just wasn't an option to say, well, let us just all sit down and discuss if this is okay for us as Zen monks. On the other hand, I mean, if you are the Roshi in that place, or if you're one of the older students, then of course you have to also address that question and you have to find an answer if that's really what you want to do. If that's really what you want to do. So many people put up with abuse from the teacher because they are there to solve the answer to their life. And they think that whatever he is doing, he being the teacher, which can also be a she, of course, whatever he is doing is just to bring them to the edge. So that's what I talked about last time. You start to rationalize. One of the most recent scandals was Joshu Sasaki in California. Well, it's not super recent anymore, but it happened a couple of years ago. Well, it started decades ago, but it was a small internet topic about 5 years ago, I think. Joshu Sasaki in California, who was abusing his female students. People were scared to say anything and thought he was still important. Sometimes you just have to challenge the teacher. Next question by Edwards. With Mia Ula, the main things were that he started to drink heavily and shut himself off. My answer, yeah, there was no abuse. So, I mean, I didn't hear about any sexual abuse, no power abuse. I mean, this you don't count at all thing. You could say that that's also you don't count at all. How can you say something like that? We all count. We all have a right to live. We are all equal. How can you possibly tell somebody that he doesn't count at all? So, but I mean, apart from saying things like that, there was really no serious verbal abuse, I would say. So yeah, there was no abuse, but he was running around with a gun shooting crows. So maybe people questioned him as a Buddhist. So, well, he had this gun and he was shooting crows and also boars during the winter. It was mainly to protect the fields from the damage that these birds and these animals would do. but also sometimes seeing him there sitting at the window during the daytime aiming at the crows. Yeah, yeah, you would wonder. You would wonder if he wouldn't have more important things to do. Whatever. Next question. But you feel he also neglected his position. My answer. Yes, I just think that situation was too much for him. Maybe his wife supported him, but it was not enough. I had the advantage of having a family. Tomomi and the kids give me a lot of stability in my life. Also, because I'm a foreigner, there's a certain interest from the media. There's book deals and I'm invited to talks. He was a shy person, so Miyaula, my teacher, was a shy person, but I felt comfortable. He was a shy person, but I felt comfortable. I was lucky as the blue-eyed Zen master in Japan. I had it much easier than he had. So when you're the abbot of Antaiji, having a family is of course also in a way it's a burden. You have a monastery to care for and you have to somehow make sure that you can pay the bills, and then you have a family and you have even more bills to pay. You have responsibility for your wife and kids. And then when you're kind of invited to talks, how come that this blue-eyed foreigner came to Japan is practicing Zen? It's nice that the interest is there, but also you're extra busy. But on the other hand, without that, like if people would ask me what was really difficult about being the abbot of Antaiji during these years that I stayed there, one thing that makes it difficult is that you cannot leave. It's difficult for everyone in Antaiji, and during the first 2-3 years when you're at the bottom of the ladder, often you think that you have the hardest job. Because you have no responsibility and everybody tells you to do this and you have to do that and there's no option. But actually in a way it's still the easiest and you can always leave. Take your stuff and leave, and even after 5 or 10 years you can still take your stuff and leave. And a lot of people do exactly that. But if you're the abbot, the only thing you can't do is leave. While everybody else can leave, and actually people are leaving, often like when it was spring, like right now it's spring season, and I look at the people I have and ask myself, well, who can I put in charge of the rice fields, the vegetable fields? I realized that most of the people weren't there the year before. So even after 1 year, a good portion of the Sangha had changed, especially during the first 10 years. That was the main problem, that people wouldn't stay for a year or longer. And now we have this new rule, well, if you come, then please stay for 3 years minimum. But again, there's few people who stay longer than 3 years. And 3 years for me, it's kind of a minimum. That's the start line. But a lot of people interpret it as the goal. You stay 3 years and then you finished your Antaiji training. And if you become the abbot, you cannot just take the responsibility for 3 years. I mean, you have to be willing to do it for probably longer than a decade. So then it becomes important to have a certain support, and family gives you that support because they don't leave you. And if there's also this kind of interest from the media, or you're invited to give a talk, it's a positive feedback that people are even, though people that come to your talks, it's not that they share your practice, but there's an interest, and people seem, at least they seem to appreciate that there's people even today choosing this way of life, practicing Zen in the mountain. So for me, that's something that helped me a lot. And my teacher didn't have this privilege. He didn't have children, and also in his case there wasn't this media interest, and he was not invited to give talks. So that made it easier for me than for my teacher. Now there is the question, who will be the next abbot? Yeah, well, basically that question has been answered last year. The only option is Echo. So that's the next abbot of Antaiji. One of my Japanese students, a Japanese nun. She doesn't know how she will perform in that role. Well, nobody knows, of course. Nobody knows how she will perform as the new abbess, just as I had no idea how I would perform. Nobody knew that 18 years ago, what would become of Antaiji once there's this foreigner running the place. There's always the hope that it will trigger a positive change, but it is a heavy burden. Who knows who will stay, or if new people will even come? She's a woman, so people could look down on her. I don't know how much that's actually the case. Probably less in the West than in Japan, and even in Japan now. I don't see it so much as a danger or as a problem that people would look down on Eko-san because she's only a woman. I don't know. I don't know how many people would take that perspective, but it could be. It could be. Especially with older, conservative Japanese. On the other hand, sometimes people ask me, did you choose her because she's a woman? And the answer, of course, is no. No. I mean, if Eko-san had been a man, I would have chosen her as well. I didn't choose her because she's a woman. I didn't want to make a kind of point that the future of Zen are female Zen masters. She happens to be a woman. So that's it. That's it. And maybe for some people that might also be a reason to now say, well, if the abbess is a woman, then I might want to check out Antaiji. Why not? But I certainly did not choose Eko-san as my successor because she's a woman. Next question. Is there something about the setup of Antaiji that can crush you? Or is it up to the individual to create the situation? I'm not quite sure how Edward meant this expression, or what he meant when he said crush you, but I interpret it as a heavy burden. That is, being responsible for a place like Antaiji can be a heavy burden. So What makes that burden so heavy? Or is it maybe up to the individual how heavy you feel the burden is? My answer is, it is up to you. You don't have to allow yourself to be crushed. I lived in a tent before, so 18 years ago, before I became the abbot, I lived in Osaka in the tent for 6 months. So I've felt that if I had to, I could just do that again. I lived in a tent before, so I felt that if I had to, I could just do that again. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is, if it doesn't work out, people don't come to Antaiji anymore, the place falls to pieces, I can always return to living in a park. So if nobody else would do the job, I'm gonna do it. I'm not sure if I succeed, but in the worst place, I'm gonna go back to where I came from, which is being a homeless in the park. I don't feel that these buildings need to stay standing for another 150 years from now. What most Japanese priests, when they take charge of a temple in Japan, first think of is they somehow have to repair the buildings, make sure that the buildings stay in a good shape, because that's what the parish expects. And there's no sangha, basically. The temples have a parish, but the parish doesn't visit the temple except for funeral ceremonies. So what the priest is responsible for is to take care of the ceremonies and to make sure that the buildings stay in a good shape. And in the case of Antaiji, I never felt that that was my most important kind of job, to make sure that the buildings stay in place. I would hope that Antaiji still stands in that place in 150 years ago, but in 150 years from now, but who knows, might be difficult. Because right now, Antaiji is doing fine when it comes to paying the bills, but it's 50 years since the buildings were built. 50 years is not a super long time, but with the amount of snow there and the quality of the building, most Japanese houses, they are rebuilt every 50 years. Like wooden architecture in Japan is not made for eternity, but most houses are rebuilt after 50 years, especially on that coast, on the northern coast, where it's very humid and you have all that snow. And even in the south, for example, there's this famous Ise shrine, and they make a point of completely tearing it down and rebuilding it every 20 years. So Japanese, they don't have this idea that you build a temple and then it stays there for centuries. I mean, Eheiji is centuries old, but also Eheiji, I mean, it burned down and it's rebuilt. I think the oldest buildings at Eheiji are maybe 200 years old. Nothing there is from the time of Dogen. So basically what I'm saying is that Antaiji probably needs to be rebuilt in a couple of decades. But, well, that will take millions. While paying the bills, if you have $20,000 a year, that's more than enough. Even $10,000 a year are it's kind of the minimum that you need to live there and pay the bills for 1 year. If you have 20,000, you have more than you need. But if you want to rebuild the place, you need $1 million. So that's quite something different. But if you think that you failed this place and the legacy, then yeah, it might crush you. So if I had thought that it's my job to rebuild Antaiji during my abbacy, that would have probably destroyed me. It would have been too heavy of a burden. But in my case, I never thought seriously about rebuilding the place. But there is no reason that Antaiji must exist here forever. If you look back at the early times of the Buddha, they had nothing. So, I mean, the Buddha never thought about building a place for practice that would last for centuries or millenniums. And actually, all of these places that they had at the time, they eventually disappeared. Crushed, I ask. Basically, what crushed me, or what was a heavy burden? I felt crushed by people, and I don't know, maybe crushed isn't the right word here, but anyway, what I say here is I felt crushed by people coming here with severe mental health problems. I'm not a trained psychologist. I would love to give them the care if I had the knowledge, but I don't. What crushes me is this feeling that people expect more than I can give. Some people are desperate and suicidal, just like what I just talked about. For them, it's a life and death question. I could kill myself today, but let's give it another try. Let's go to Antaiji. Let's participate in a session and see if it makes a difference. Some people are desperate and suicidal. I know of 4 cases of people that committed suicide after leaving Antaiji. One of those was before I was abbot, and 3 was when I was the abbot. Like, if people would ask me how many people visited Antaiji during the time you were the abbot, the answer would be probably more than 1,000, I would say. Especially during the first decade when I didn't make any restrictions on visiting Antaiji. You could come anytime, you could leave anytime, you didn't need to speak any Japanese, there was no age restriction. People were just kind of going through, and some people were even using Antaiji like a kind of guest house. So there were many visitors during the year, and some of them stayed in contact, but of course most of them you don't hear from them anymore. And it was only by chance or through accident that in the case of 3 persons after I became the abbot, I heard, didn't you hear that that person, they died, they committed suicide last year or so. In most cases, it was not right after they left Antaiji. There were 2 years, 3 years after they left Antaiji, I heard through a rumor, through a friend, that person, they don't live anymore. And I could imagine that the how do you say in German? You say Dunkelziffer, the kind of dark number. The number is actually much higher. It's just that among these 1,000 people that went through Antaiji, I could imagine that much more people actually killed themselves. And of course, you could also ask what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? It's their decision. It's their life, and everybody can choose by themselves if they want to live or if they want to die. So there's no, from that perspective, there would be no reason for me to feel in any way responsible, and probably there's no direct direct connection between their stay in Antaiji and the fact that they later committed suicide. But at least from my perspective, there were times where I was quite suicidal. And I would say that Zen, in a way, it saved my life. It saved my life, so therefore I indeed feel that I fail people that visit Antaiji and I spend time with them and then later they commit suicide. I wish I could have done more, offered more, but I couldn't. So, I mean, saying that crushed me is maybe a little bit over the top, but that's the biggest burden on myself. If you would ask me, what are you the most, how do you say, happy about? So after these 18 years as the abbot, what would you say was the best thing? What are you most happy about? And I would say that during these 18 years, nobody died at Antaiji. Not through suicide and not through an accident. And of course, people die all the time. People have died at Antaiji before I became the abbot, and people will die in the future also at Antaiji. It can happen anytime. It could have happened during these 18 years, even to myself. There were some dangerous situations, and it's almost a miracle. It's almost a miracle that it didn't happen. I'm really grateful for that. On the other hand, just as I said, I wish I could have triggered that kind of change that happened in myself through Zen, that I wake up in the morning and rather than asking myself, oh, why am I back here? Another dreadful, boring, tiresome day. Rather than that, there's this, you wake up and you say, wow, I have another day. Another 24 hours. For me, I think this change of perspective is related to my Zen practice. So I wish I could have shared that with more people. Back to the texts. In the case of these 4 people, their parents told me and said their child spoke highly of Antaiji and thought of going back, but then killed themselves. So that was one of these 4 people. I later got a mail from the parents and they said our son has just committed suicide, but actually he was always talking about Antaiji, the stay at Antaiji 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I think that kid had stayed for only a week or 2 and he wanted to come back one day, but he committed suicide before. Do you have any explanations? They asked me, and I said, no, I'm sorry. Yeah. And Edward asks, last question, that must have weighed heavily on your conscience. And my answer, Yes, it crushed me being the last straw that people clung onto. Yeah, but I guess that's something that every teacher has to live with. And again, crushing is maybe not the right word, but it's certainly a heavy burden. Hmm. Okay, so this is the last part of my Teacher's House series. Sorry that it took me a whole year. There were long gaps in between. Some people asked me if I'm planning to do something after this, and I have no concrete plans, but sure I'm gonna still be on YouTube. And as you know, I do certain things in Japanese only. I do certain things in German as well, but I'm certainly also do something in English again, and I appreciate your interest. I look forward to seeing you again, although I'm not able to see you. You can see me on the screen, but yeah, let's stay in contact. And thank you for watching.